specifically what we're going to do.
Great. I'm delighted to. I mean, I'm just really happy this is happening. And I suppose if I was to make one more link to what Philippa just said, this has come about because of a long-standing interest that Philippa and I have had in participative ways of doing strategy, which go back, oh, how long, Philippa? When did we start working on this?
A while ago, more than a decade ago.
Yes, I think it's more than that, but yeah, a while anyway. And Philippa and I have written a load of stuff, some of which got an audience and some of which just disappeared into the ether. And we've been delighted in the past, probably 2 to 3 years, to see a lot more notice being taken of participative strategy, or as some people are now calling it, open strategy. We don't mind what people call it, but we do mind that it happens because it's so important. And I was therefore really delighted when Olga and William got in touch to say that WaterAid were going to use a participative process for their strategy. And Rick, can we show the picture? Because the work that they did led to the WaterAid global strategy from now till 2032, and that's the document on the left, and it was launched recently. I'm sure Olga and William will say something about that, but it was done using this really wholehearted participative process, and I was blown away by what a fantastic story it was. And we asked John to work with Olga and William to produce an article because we thought this just deserved to be known about. And the article on the right is the proof copy of the European Business Review article co-authored by the folks leading this call today, who tell the story, and it comes out next month. And you don't need to worry about finding it, because everybody who's on this call and everybody who's registered will receive a link the moment we have it. So you'll receive a link to the article, and we encourage you to read it and to share it widely. So I think, Rick, we can close that screen, and that's kind of enough for me, except to say, obviously we're recording. We've asked John to continue his great work by now leading a conversation about what you found from the conversations with Olga and William, and about half an hour, 40 minutes for that. If people have questions as we go, pop them into the chat. Philippa, John, and myself will try to manage the questions. After about 30-40 minutes, we'll switch into conversation mode.
And I think the only other thing to say is that John, Olga, and Will, if you could introduce yourselves in whichever way you want and in whatever order you want, that would be great.
Over to you.
Thanks. Just check I have remembered to unmute myself, which is always the starting point. Good thumbs up there. So my name is John Higgins, who I'm not known to you, those I'm not known to. I am the GameShift Research Fellow, publish and write a lot, and have been working. I've got to check. Will, is it Will or William? I've noticed that Chris is calling you William.
I mean, I'm very relaxed, probably Will by mild preference.
Okay, I'll go with Will, thanks. Because on my notes here, I've got ask Will at periodic points. So I was just suddenly thinking I was going to have to shift all that and remember to say William. So I write widely, research widely in all matters organizational. And I got involved with Olga and Will in June, I think, was when we started writing up the process. And like all these things, there's always that tension between the sort of the very polite, formal, with the suit on and the tie done up description of what the process is, and me with my sort of research hat on, wants always to get to the underbelly of what really happened. We had a meeting to discuss this slightly contentious issue, and you want to say, was there actually blood on the wall or not? And it's that whole tension which any organization has to hold between how do you talk openly about your experience without being absurd and laying yourself open to attack and these sorts of things. So I think that Will and Olga have hit exactly the right note, which is they were able to bring enough of the grit without it becoming too self-flagellatory or anything. So it was enough of a really good story, but it wasn't so good that it didn't feel unreal. So that's what I've really sort of experienced between the two of you. So I noticed on my notes, and I'd suggest, Olga and Will, is that you introduce yourself just prior to the first question I ask each of you, because this is a lightly scripted event in that I do have a run of questions and I do know which of Olga and Will I'm meant to be asking them to. So if I get this wrong, Olga and Will also come back to me and tell me. So Olga, I believe the first question is coming to you, and it's, what made a participative strategy process the way you had to go? And how did it fit with the existing WaterAid culture, which is obviously a very leading thing? So first introduce yourself a bit, Olga, and then say a bit about that big picture about why you went the participative route.
Thank you, John. Good morning, everyone. My name is Olga Ghazaryan, and I'm the Director of International Programs for WaterAid. Just to say so that I'm really pleased to be here, and thank you very much for attending this event. I'll say one word about what WaterAid is, so people know what we're talking about. So WaterAid is the largest global not-for-profit organization, which was set up by UK water industry in 1981. And its mission is to transform lives by achieving universal access to water, sanitation, and hygiene. So now to your question, John. So WaterAid is a federated global organization. It has 7 members and it works across 25 countries. So we do not have a single center of command that can impose its will. And the organization, excuse me, has a long-standing tradition and culture of employee engagement in making key strategic decisions in a consultative way. It is because the operational complexity and the geographic dispersal means that the local realities defy the imposition of one-size-fits-all solutions. And because the on-the-ground knowledge is essential, an essential source of insight, it has created a consultative organizational culture. So it was very obvious that such a future-defining thing as a strategy for the next 10 years, that was a very big deal for everyone in the organization, would be a participative one, an open one. And the process and the product needed to be trusted, accepted, owned by everyone in WaterAid. And so it needed to align with the culture and with the values of the organization. Thanks. Over to you.
Thank you, Olga. I was just thinking, oh, what's the follow-up question as you were going through that, and you answered each one as it popped into my head. And I think, Will, the next question is going to be a bit of a slam dunk, I expect, which is, there are legions of external strategy expert firms. There's a whole industry out there. You didn't hand your process over to them. What was your thinking behind, we're going to do this ourselves?
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is, my role in WaterAid is as the head of strategy, so looking across that federation Olga's talking about to try to support individual members and the whole federation think about strategy and performance. And in the dim past, I used to be one of those legions of strategy advisors that John's just talked about. That was my first job at a university. And it's not because those people are bad at what they do or they aren't able to bring insight. For us, it was really important, and that's true for the global strategy and for individual countries who are writing their strategies right now. The value of this is partly a right answer, but there isn't some magical perfect solution. But most importantly, that the whole organization owns the answer, and while the analytics you can outsource, you can't outsource that buy-in and that engagement, and the more that you rely on others to do your thinking for you. I think there's a few things. One, people haven't thought about it, but two, they haven't confronted some of those key decisions. So we did use some external support. GameShift it helps us just think through some of the overall process, but we also use them in specific areas about our approach to humanitarian work, our approach to the private sector, and a couple of the knotty issues. We needed people to partly to give us a bit of capacity, but also to give us a bit of insight on those things. So, we weren't afraid to use those on specific issues, but we really wanted to hold that overall process inside the organisation as a conversation, as we're going to talk about, I think, a bit later.
Thanks, Will. What you've just clicked in my own mind is this whole notion you cannot outsource organizational learning. And that's what I mean, as I listened to the two of you talk about your process, that struck me that you were really tapping into taking a collective intelligence seriously, which of course is the title of the article. And it's much talked about, but there's a lot of hard work you have to do to achieve it. And that therefore segues into my next question, which I think is for Olga. Which is the process took a long time. I think it was at least 18 months. I want to ask a number of questions on that. Did that matter that it took so long? And what were the trade-offs? Because there's always a trade-off between speed and participation.
That's a really good question. Thank you, John. Well, participative strategies take time, and we were aware of it, but they take time at the upstream. What you lose at the upstream, you gain at the downstream, and I'll explain that. You cannot shortcut how long it takes for people to digest and respond to proposals and decisions, to ask questions, to think through complex issues. So what we learned from our previous strategy is that we should not allow the whole organization to get paralyzed while doing a strategy, because we had to deliver impact in the external world. And so we decided to do the strategy with a small team. And the key design principle was to for our time to fit around the work demands that already exist for people. And for those of us who were at the heart of the strategy, it felt very inefficient, but it was not about efficient use of our time or the strategy team time. The key focus was the effective use of time and resources across the whole organization. So when the strategy was launched, it was widely understood, accepted, owned, and it took less time downstream to start the transition. The trade-offs were our time versus the organization time spent upstream versus downstream, the pace that enabled people to continue their delivering external impact for poor people versus the pace to finish the strategy with less focus on external impact. And also it was a trade-off versus pace versus trust in the process and ownership. Thanks.
I think it's also worth noting, if you ask Olga and I how long it took, we'll say 18 months, because that's when we started. But if, as Olga says, you look at the rest of the organization, again, true for a lot of strategies, but particularly true for this one, they wouldn't describe it as 18 months of endlessly talking about the strategy. They didn't see it till the material sort of several months in, and there were some very fixed points of engagement, precisely for that reason Olga said. It's really important it doesn't get in the way of delivery. So I think that investment of time was, it was invisible to the whole organization, as it should be. And it's worth noting that partly because of our culture, and this we have in common with lots of federation organizations, there is just a governance time element. It was not a surprise. The question was not, can we do this in 3 months, but a much more open one of how long is this going to take to do that. But I think getting that sense of the right people involved for the right length of time, as Olga says, investing up front, but the rest of the organization wouldn't have known that Olga and I at the beginning of this were putting a whole set of things together over several months.
Really, one thing I want to just pick up that Olga was saying there is that trade-off between pace and trust. And I was just thinking of the Edelman Trust Index stuff, which continues to report that trust within organizational settings continues not to be very high. And I think that our fixation in so much of those of us who work in the organizational development field is we want pace, 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 and we don't see that this erots trust, and that there is a trade-off to be made. So I was really struck by that, Olga. I'd now like to ask you something a bit more personal. And I thought it was, again, Olga, you presented it, in a very modulated frame. You said, well, it was not a very efficient use of our time, but wasn't it great that the wider organization, its time was used very efficiently? And I have a fairly strong hurry up driver in me. So I'm thinking I would have been chewing the floor, I think, quite early on. But so the question is, and this goes to both of you, but I'll start with you, Olga, which is, so at a personal level, how did you not get frustrated? You understood intellectually what you were doing, but the emotions of it, it must have got, well, I'm assuming got to you, because you had to repeat lots of conversations and workshops with people. That was one of the themes that really came across very strongly to me when talking to the two of you. Olga.
Thanks. Thanks, John. Well, I was frustrated, of course. I think there were times when I was very frustrated, especially when there were decisions made and then they were reopened as if we haven't made those decisions. But I think my understanding was that people were really busy with other things and they would forget. It wasn't the most important thing on their mind. And I think also I was frustrated with ourselves as well, because we didn't get everything right as well. Like, for example, we thought about some of the issues that were political in a technocratic way, and then we had to change it. So, of course, in a process like this, there was a lot of frustration. But I think one of the key lessons is you cannot communicate enough in a strategy development process if you have an organization-wide conversation. So yeah, it was, as you described very well, it was an emotional labor, hard emotional labor. Will, do you want to come in on that?
Yeah, so I'd agree with everything Olga said. I think there's also an element, I'm often a bit skeptical of sort of joint accountability and sort of getting two people to do something because it falls in the cracks. But I'm incredibly glad we had two of us doing this because we had obviously an inner circle of a wider group, but there were moments where Olga and I could vent to each other. Olga and I have known each other quite a long time. We've worked together on a set of things, high levels of trust in competence, but also, how can I phrase it, complementary personalities going in, which meant we got annoyed about slightly different things, but also we could help each other go through that, because of course it's frustrating. Someone hasn't read the briefing, or they haven't, or they've forgotten they've agreed to this already, or they're asking a question we've already discussed, and all those kind of things. And these happen all the time anyway, but they certainly happen in big strategies. So I think Olga and I being able to just vent a bit at each other and also step in. There were definitely meetings where I slightly lost my temper and had to sort of step away for a bit. And it's worth noting, we did the whole thing virtually. So Olga and I met physically many times before, but we did kicked off the whole strategy process in lockdown, or function in lockdown. And Olga and I didn't physically meet again until we'd basically signed the whole thing off. It's not deliberately, it's just that the way it had worked. I remember walking through a wet park in Oxford, where Olga lives, after we pretty much signed everything off, saying, what do we need to do now? And it was the first time we'd physically done. So there was that added, there were loads of benefits to doing that virtual nature, but there was that added frustration that sometimes it was literally, my laptop stopped working. I can't make this meeting. So having that real personal sort of trust and space to shout about it a bit without anyone else getting offended was certainly very helpful for me. I think it's probably helpful for the organization as well.
I'm going to just move slightly off piece before going back onto the scripted questions to the two of you. So do jump in to answer this in whichever order you want. But I have a very strong relational turn, so I'm always fascinated by the relational glue that makes something work. And so the question I've just written down here is, how did you get the best from each other?
That's a good question. Yeah, I think when we went into this process, I think we knew what we were strong at and not so strong at, both of us. And I think both of us have a strategy background, but in very different way and in a very different experience. And I think that we agreed up front what we will lead on and what the other one will lead on. But I think it was very flexible, and I think it was, honestly, this was the best collaboration I had, because there were very few things that we really disagreed on. Well, there were things that we disagreed on, but we didn't, it didn't turn into a conflict that was disruptive. And we were very candid with each other. When we didn't like something the other one did, we would call and talk about it. Will?
Yeah, I'd agree. I think I think we agreed on a lot of things, but we did disagree well. I think it really helps having sort of quite defined roles going in. So the, you know, Olga's background, I say Olga says, different backgrounds, and so it's quite a lot. It was obvious who was going to pick up what in terms of those things. But I think the other thing is that real flexibility, and we just talked a lot. There were days where I would literally have meetings of Olga plus others throughout the day, and some of those were just one-to-ones, to be able to just pick up the virtual phone and say, I can't do this, I don't know how this is going to work. And that's particularly important when you have sort of lockdown related things intruding in, but also critically when you've got surprising elements of work. So you can't plan these things out, the things flare up that suddenly require an awful lot of work. I talked about the private sector a bit earlier. We didn't anticipate that being a major strand of work when we scoped this at the beginning. And it sort of became more significant to be a key part of our strategy, to do more engagement about that. That's because of some work we did coming through. And that real flexibility that goes, oh, one of us is going to take that, happened to be me. Well, that means other things need to get shuffled around and doing that. The stylistic thing Olga is sort of skirting around is that is also just a really clear sense of, we have a process, we contracted that up front with the organization, and we knew, you know, we both were quite pragmatic and quite sort of deadline focused on those things. So we didn't let each other off the hook for that. And that meant that we did hit those deadlines and for the organization, they were able to do that.
Thanks. Well, I've noticed actually you've sort of begun to touch on a couple of other questions.
Yes.
I'll still probably, that's okay. I'm going to probably go back to them anyway. One of the things that I heard you say there, which was disagree well, and in all my research into speaking truth to power and all these sorts of things, is that capacity to disagree well is one of the magic ingredients that I think a lot of organizations fear disagreement to such an extent that they sort of bury everything, because to have dissenting voices is somehow viewed as a sign of weakness rather than a sign of healthy organizational dialogue, which, you know, maybe I think you sort of touched a bit on this, but with specifically things that you'd be happy to talk about with the WaterAid thing. But so participant approaches bring a lot of difficult issues out into the open. What were the ones that particularly came out that had to be lived with through the life of the strategy?
Yeah, and I think the thing you've described is true for WaterAid. And I think it's I've worked in commercial and non-commercial environments through my both of them in my career. I think it's particularly true in non-commercial environments, because you can't sort of refer back to profit as your answer, and there isn't a single scorecard for these things. Slightly caricaturing it, but I don't think too much. And certainly WaterAid, I think that is a tendency to look for consensus. And there were several of those. So you can see those in strategy. We made some explicit decisions about the country portfolio. We explicitly wanted to have fewer countries so that we could give more attention and resources to those we focused on. I've talked about the engagement with the private sector. That was a controversial issue of some parts of the organization. Quite a lot of things were difficult for parts, but not all of the organization, rather than difficult for the organization as a whole. You know, while this was happening, you know, real sector-wide examination of how we think about sort of global north, global south power dynamics and anti-racism and so forth. True for all international NGOs, true for all organizations, but particularly true for international NGOs predominantly headquartered in sort of rich Western countries, but serving people who don't live there. And there was a string of other ones I'm sure I'm forgetting. Olga will have a few more too. So Olga and I were very conscious of that, and we really, really wanted to face that head on. So very early on, we didn't get them all, but we tried to call out the things we were going to address, but also the things we weren't. So we also have a set of running organizational saws that all organizations have. And we were explicit about which ones we wanted to address. So portfolio, yes, absolutely. But also ones we weren't going to do. So we didn't want to, a few internal things we explicitly didn't want to do. And some people didn't like that. And this comes up now when people say, oh, actually, I wish we'd addressed X, but we want to be really clear upfront, and kept repeating that. So there's a point about 9 months in where we started to say to our senior sort of decision makers, here are the decisions we still have to make. Here are the things we have to resolve. About 9 of them, Olga, I can't remember the exact number, but it was like, here are the issues. And some of them sort of melted away, but others, were really sort of timetabled and stayed with us right through the process until we resolved them. And just that warning, that visibility, so that no one could duck out of it. And then we enlisted, and then I think there's a role for people to do that, to not sort of fudge it and say, oh, we're going to talk about X today, or we've sort of agreed, but to keep coming back. So that portfolio one, I think we came back 3 or 4 times. We had a few goes at it. The first time we tried to do it, didn't work. We did a different methodology. And we listed some of the other people in the organization who are really good at this. So we have a global director who sort of works with the whole federation. We used him to say, actually, we need other voices to help force the organization, its senior decision makers in this case, to address that. But others, it was us saying, no, we're going to come back and ask you about that. Prioritization of what we do. We went back and back to the organization to say, no, we actually want you to rank these. We want you to do these so that we can so that we can address those. And some of those were unexpected, but a lot we'd planned in advance and just kept talking about.
Olga, you probably got a view of some of those issues, but particularly talking around the question of, so some of these things, raising these issues, and again, we're talking about in a very moderated after the event occasion, and it's stripping a lot of the emotional contestation that comes with these things. And so the sense I got from talking to you was that you were able to have conflict without it turning toxic. How did you do that?
I think one thing that helped a lot, all of the senior leaders in the organization, irrespective of the strategy, went through a training which was about having courageous conversations, which was like disagreeing well. It wasn't related to strategy, but it helped a lot. I think the other thing was that because we were very plugged in internal networks, we were very well connected, and also because everything was upfront, we had debates and decisions within parameters, and we were very honest. And just to say, it wasn't just Will and myself, we had a steering group that was guiding this process. And we were very upfront, what is up for grab, what is not, and how we are going to have, and we asked people how to help those conversations. The other thing is that because we were so plugged in the networks, different networks of the organization, we knew how the organization works, how people think, what would trigger them, how to have these conversations in a way to have a good conflict rather than a bad one. And I think the other thing that is really critical is that this process also involved a lot of polling and data collection. When there were things that required choices of the whole organization, we made sure that we had some touch points with all of the teams, and they could go away, discuss it, and come back with the choices of the options that we put forward. And it was also trusting the wisdom of the crowd in making difficult choices. So when at the end things came up where people disagreed with, even after the decisions were made, they were clear why the decisions were made, how they were made. They trusted the process. And I must say, like, honestly, there wasn't a huge disagreement at the end of it. There were huge disagreements throughout the process. And of course, I think it was relational. You need to just, that person, you call them, you say, I know you're like really angry, so let's have a conversation what we can do. So there was a lot of emotional labor involved there.
There were just so many points there. I mean, I was just scribbling notes as we were doing that. I was thinking, oh gosh, there's another article to write here, which is how I see the world. But that thing of that transparency of the process and people trusting the process, so that even if the decision isn't the one that you wanted to, you saw where it had come from. And I'm just again thinking, so many strategy process are, particularly when they're externally driven and when they're the efficiency of the external experts is the driver thing. People sort of haven't had the time to say, where did that decision come from?
Mm-hmm.
I'm just going to check, Chris and Philippa, where are we on time?
I think we've still time to carry on with your questions and the discussion you're having. I think it's really interesting.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay. At least 10 minutes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, Will, I've got you up to this next one. You, the next question, you've already really sort of answered the first part of the question, which is how do you set the boundaries between what was and wasn't up for discussion? But the second bit, which both you and Olga have alluded to, but was how did you engage with the established senior decision-making bodies? The way that you used them was I mean, quite intrusive on their time, was one of the things that stood out for me. So, Will, I've got you down as to lead off on that.
Yeah, I mean, the short answer is, as you say, a lot. I mean, it was, I think we're fortunate, there are downsides to this too, that our senior decision makers like strategy. I'm not sure they were quite prepared for some of the strategy conversations they got, but I think it's, strategy is interesting. I think so anyway. And I think for our organization, that is true. So I think they were up for it in principle. And wanted to get this right, and we're seeing that now. It's a challenging environment for an awful lot of organisations. Ours is no exception. I think they're very pleased that we've got a recent strategy that we can point to and say, look, this will help us prioritise. So they were up for that. We did, but we also did need to do that contracting up front. And I think you talked about frustration earlier. There were definitely moments in the first few months I felt we weren't really moving. Like all big projects, they take a while to get off the ground, and this one really did, partly because we were spending quite a bit of time agreeing a whole load of things we talked about already, but also how often are we going to talk to you, and when are you going to see this? And that's obviously a different rhythm for the board, different rhythm for boards plural, because we have 8 boards as an organization because of that federation that we've talked about, and we were really clear about that with them, and then that cascades through the process, particularly our senior leaders, and we kept updating them. I think we ended up with a template about halfway through the process that was literally, here is your future agenda. These are the weeks where it's going to be every week. Here's the week we're going to have to do it more than once a week because we've got a really critical decision. And keeping that engagement. As Olga I'm sure will say, there's also some individual relations within that. So it's, for several of the key issues, there were specific leaders who were engaged or leading or heavily involved in the process, be it the finance director and some of the finance staff, or others on particular topics, policy around private sector or whatever. And using them as champions is, I think, an important part of ensuring that engagement and appetite to do it. But look, I'm sure there were moments where they were bored out of their minds having to do this again, but I think we had by that point buy-in around the process, and also participation drives that. If the whole organization has given up their time to look at some specific things, then I think that pushes leaders to do their bit as well, and to engage on it. So I think we structured it really clearly, but we were fortunate to have a set of leaders who were really keen to do this and do this right.
Yeah, and also the board's deadlines helped us to contain the time, because it could have lasted much longer. Yeah. We left it like that. So and as Will said, to give credit to the board, I think they gave away a lot of their time at really on social hours and came in and engaged.
Thank you, Olga. Right, so just shift focus, and the next question is back to you again, Olga. And there was something about the virtual working when in the article we drew out. We said COVID actually proved a blessing for the participation. And I'm going to ask you the very leading question, which I think we've agreed, which is, could you say more about this with particular reference to shifting the focus away from London and the global north?
Yeah, it was not only about the strategy, but when we were doing the strategy, it was at the time when almost everyone in the world, all the countries, almost every countries were in the lockdown, so working from home. And with moving to full online events, it gave an equality of experience, which was different to when people were expected to travel to London or to Rwanda or to another capital in the global north or south. And that made sure that people had exactly the same experience of participation wherever they were located and whatever their function or the role they played. So it wasn't then some people were huddled and had it helped with the trust a lot, because everybody was working from the same places, participating in the same events. And I think it was one of the things that helped to shift power as well. Will alluded to it, the power between global north and global south. So I'm not saying it was great that everything was online, because there is nothing compared to when people get into a room and just nail some problems, just problem solve. It made it longer, but it also made the experience equal and the participation. And we could talk to 400, 500 people in one go. That was also very good. Thanks.
I think there's a perception angle to that too. So
Yeah.
you know, we could always, we frequently, or a global organization frequently did those global calls, but rightly, in some cases, people could feel, oh, there's 6 people in a room in London and 6 of us on a call. It's no surprises who's getting heard. And I think there was a bit of a blind spot for us generally, but I think, but there's a real perception that actually we're all little boxes on a screen. I'm getting heard regardless of where I am, and that's true if there are 400 or if there are 4. And that was right through, I mean, not just the strategy, but it was certainly true right through the strategy.
Yeah, and the chat boxes also helped. What we also did, well, just to say, there were a lot of online tools where people came and they just wrote things, and then we were able to take it away and analyze. And so the polling, data collection, just checking the temperature of the organization, etc., was easier in that way.
I'm just really struck by the use of the phrase, I don't think we used it in the article, which is the equality of experience. And that really, stood out for me as you were talking there. Right, we're going to sort of finish with the last question, which is to the both of you. And I've got a view about this as well, so I'll come in right at the end on this. But so we've got 6 conclusions at the end of the article about, what makes for a participative strategy based on your WaterAid experience work. They're obviously all important, but which for each of you are the top 2? If you were only allowed 2, which would they be? Olga, Will?
Okay, so for me, it was being clear and transparent about the approach, what's going on, when, who is involved, how decisions will be made, who will make the decisions, and a visible roadmap, so everybody could see what was happening and how makes the decisive calls. And the other one is laying the areas of contention and tension up front, with some parameters to talk to resolve them, or sometimes you don't resolve, you live with them, you live with those tensions. For me, those were the 2. Will?
So I definitely echo that second one. I think if nothing else, it's for our own sanity, it was important that we saying this one we're going to have a fight about as an organization, this one we're not. That, laying out the contentious areas and being really clear about those, I think just guides the whole organization, but also the team. I think for me, I really struggle with this question because I think there are I would hate to have done this process without any of them. But for me, there is that consulting wisely and widely. Well, I'm just thinking 3 on the list. I'd say, you've got to get it right. You know, bad consultation is bad because it's paralyzing. But done right, and I wouldn't say we did perfectly, but I think we did the main things right. It just changed completely the tenor of some of the conversations. I think particularly around the prioritizing of what we really wanted to focus on. It's just a completely different conversation in the leadership if you know what the organization who are actually going to have to do this think. Even if it's imperfect, because of course it is, but it just completely changed how we had those discussions and decisions at the top end.
I'll just come in. So my top one was fitting in around the work demands of people in their day-to-day life. I thought the privileging of their lives, their priorities come first. The strategy team's needs come second. That really stood out for me.
Yeah, so we've covered 4 between us out of 6. I think that's a strong, decisive action there from all of us.
Okay, Chris, Philippa, do you want to sort of take over? Sort of what questions are coming out of the chat box for Will and Olga?
I think there are questions. I think there were comments there from earlier. I know Annette's coming back, but certainly maybe I could kick off because I have a question that was really fascinating, not having been involved in it. I had a question about the decision making, because what we often find in participative working is that decision making and being really clear about who's making what decision needs to be very explicit up front. And I think a couple of things, Olga, you talked about the wisdom of the crowd, but I wasn't sure whether, how were decisions made? Because was it one person, one vote, or were you really clear about this one where everybody does have a vote, but actually on these different topics, it's the different boards or the global board? How did you decide, and how did you frame it to people so they were really clear up front?
Yeah, thanks, Philippa. On that one, when we consulted wisely and widely, we laid out options for teams to go away and to choose from and to debate and discuss. But it was very clear that they were not decision makers. It was polling and understanding. We also said that there will be heavy weighting towards what the country teams said versus what the global North headquarters say, because they are the business units. And so we laid out the decision-making parameters in the beginning, but the decision makers were the global executive, actually, the executive. I think we worked within the organizational hierarchy, and it was very clear that we can't make decisions with 1,000 people. But the weighting was clear, the decision-making parameters we agreed with the organization, and I think that helped. And also there were, we also set out what decisions would be made when and who will do that. And it didn't work perfectly, but I think it was clear who makes decisions. And it was the formal hierarchy of the organization made the decisive ultimate calls based on what came out from the teams.
I love that fact, actually, of the privileging or putting extra weight onto the country teams, inputs. I think that's a really sort of sophisticated way, because sometimes that doesn't happen. I don't think that the people who are actually going to have to make it happen.
Yeah.
Well, we thought, who is this strategy for? Who is the main audience of this? And these were the program officers in the countries, the people at the coal front who do this. So they need to have, that's their strategy more than anybody else's. So that's why the weighting was heavily tilted towards them.
Now, there are many things I could ask directly from that question, but I noticed that Jackie has reminded us, and William has answered it, that we've told people there are 6 conclusions, but only talked about 4, but now they're in the...
Do you want to just say a little bit about it, William, since
I mean, so yeah, so I think the other two were these I've just popped in. So I think we deliberately tried to get everyone in the tent. So there are some contrary voices in the organisation, and as there should be, and as there always are. So we made sure that they, depending on where their other commitments, they were on the steering group or they were involved on the particular conversation, or we just made some really explicit attempts to consult them. I remember having a fairly rough ride from one set of people about some issues deliberately. I knew I was going in to do that, and that was really helpful to sharpen the position. So making sure those people were, we didn't just have a cozy club of people who all thought the same as we were doing it, and also, this is relational, and it mattered that that those of us who were leading the process were widely known, so that when people engaged, we were known quantities, and that's obviously not true with an external, but nor do you want your recently hired person who doesn't know anyone to be taking a lead role. It's not about how good they are, it's actually people who'd worked with Olga for many years and could trust that she was going to listen and engage, and hopefully the same for me, but not just us, for the wider team as well. We had a steering group of several people who are really important in the organization, and then on particular topics, again, key people, so that they can tap into the knowledge of the organization without it looking really awkward and missing things.
So how many people did you end up involving overall, would you say?
I think, Olga, I think there are about 60. We're an organization of about 1,100-1,200 people. There were 60 people who were involved quite extensively. I sat on the overall steering group, or key decision makers, or working party group, so did material sacrifice. And then, I mean, I'm not going to say everyone, but every single unit of the organization had their own little exercise, two times certainly. A couple had more, a few had more, and I would have thought that got to well over half the organization directly sort of engaged on those. Hard to tell. When they gathered in a room in Lilongwe, I wasn't counting heads. I wasn't there, but certainly on webinars we had upwards of 300-400 in some cases over the time zones on individual webinars.
Yeah. So, what surprised you?
One thing that surprised me, that we were talking about 10-year strategy, and people were trying to get into details very fast. And that sort of tension between looking 10 years ahead, but wanting some certainty, that was one thing. I think the other thing that surprised me very pleasantly, and I got even very emotional when we asked the teams to make choices to submit something within deadlines. Almost all did, actually. I think we were not expecting that. I was thinking, oh, we're going to chase everyone and etc., but it didn't happen. And I think we were very touched by it. So that was surprising. But I think the details were, frustrating. It's like, well, but we need certainty, but we need all this we need to do all this kind of data and analysis. It's like, no, we don't. This is a 10-year thing. Yeah. So that was surprising. Will?
I'd certainly agree with those. I was certainly going to lead on that amazing moment in May, I think it was, wasn't it, where we literally had a deadline and every single country program and all the teams elsewhere had replied to the question. I mean, some had invested huge amounts of time in it, some had done it quickly, it didn't matter. They had all replied. I definitely think that's the case. I think that was the big moment for me in terms of surprise.
It's really good to hear. I was involved very lightly, particularly early on in the process, and I know you had an intention that you would set up something that led to good quality exploring. And I just thought that on reflection, how do you feel it was as a piece of organisation-wide exploration?
I mean, I think there's a really interesting phenomenon important for the whole process, but I think genuinely people thought about some things that they just hadn't thought about, both in terms of future stuff, sort of actually what should we focus on and what does that mean? So we remember having quite a discussion of partway through the strategy, perhaps should have done this right at the beginning. It's like, what does the strategy actually mean for an individual team, an individual country program? So is this some interesting guidance you can ignore, or is this a straitjacket that you must follow? And the answer is obviously somewhere in the middle, and because context is so different in our different places that we work. So I think it's a really interesting exploration looking forward. But I think there was also an interesting sense of, I know it sounds like counterintuitive, but a lot of the core bits of analysis aren't universally known. I mean, if you did a pop quiz on how many people have access to water and sanitation, no, they'd know the first answer, but they may not know the second or third level down. I mean, the specialists do, and they'd know their own context. But I think some of this, just being able to talk, it's the strategy process, but just being able to talk about that context and engage with that, I think was really interesting for a lot of people, and I think helpful for the work they then do in their day jobs and in setting their own strategies. So I think everyone runs out of time to do everything, but I genuinely think there's a set of things that we are still thinking about how we take forward about future thinking around data. But yeah, I definitely think the organisation as a whole did that, and some teams did it an awful lot.
Could I leap in with something I've just seen in the chat, which was someone asked, going back to the conflict and the tension, that any strategic choice you make, some people will feel they have lost. And the question was around, how do you work with individuals who are the word used, disillusioned by decisions? I mean, what did you do? Because with those people, I assume you respect and all those things, who basically are upset by the choices that have been made.
Yeah, that's a good question.
Go on, Olga.
And it is also about, I think it was a good question about it could have derailed the process, and there were moments in the process where it could have happened. I guess the culture of the organization of coming to a consensus was helpful. I have worked in other organizations where things are much more combative, etc. But the culture to coming to a consensus, which of course has its dark side as well, but in this case, it was helpful to work with those people, saying, look, you are in a minority here, and this is why this happened, and this is what people said, and this is why this decision is made. At the end of it, of these things, you can't make everyone happy, and that's not the purpose. It's about how we deliver impact outside in the world. Yeah, there were disillusioned people, but I wouldn't say it was anything derailed the process, thankfully. Though there were moments when it could have happened.
I think we did talk about that up front, didn't we? The saying that we are going to push for some decisions, and that means people are going to do that. And so at the sort of executive top level, there was a sense of, actually, we are making real decisions, and these might hurt a bit. I think there's something about owning it. I think that's really, there were definitely moments where we're saying, look, I know some of you don't agree with this position, and that's okay. You don't need to agree with everything your organization does to support your organization. Everyone's making those trade-offs, and fronting up a bit to just get, to be a bit of a punch bag. Didn't happen very often. Wasn't a fundamental problem. I don't think there was a real crisis about that. But I think just being able to let people let off steam a bit and to get their views heard. And in lots of times that was really positive. People were saying, "Oh, I noticed you've changed this from the draft because of what I said," or a few people said, "I can see my words in it," and that's really positive. But I think it's also it was also the case that people said, "Look, I asked this, and you said no, it wasn't there, and you told us why." And am I delighted about that? No, clearly not. But I think for a few, not for all of them, but a few of them, actually, the important point was they were heard, not necessarily that everyone then agreed.
There was a huge tension on people wanted to discuss loads of internal things in the strategy, like business models, federation models, how kind of resources are flowing from one to another, etc. And I think we said that's not in the scope at the moment. We are talking about a 10-year strategy, external looking document. It's a directional thing, and we will discuss that later in the later stage. And some people were not happy with that, but we are discussing them now. So it's about phasing and pacing as well.
How did you find, because you said one of the things you were talking about or thinking about in the strategy was the prioritization of countries where you could have the biggest impact, which meant potentially, I presume, not being in some countries moving forward. How did you find people engaged with that? Because presumably the case of suddenly realizing potentially that their country where they were may no longer be part of WaterAid moving forward. Did you find that nonetheless people still engaged with the process, or did you find some contrary behaviors there?
I think that this was the most difficult and the most emotive issue in the strategy. And I think this was the one where we agreed to have, again, it is emotive, but you can make it a bit more objective. And it was the criteria, weightings, etc. And at the end, we made a decision on these are the countries we will exit for these reasons. And then, so we made those decisions without the countries because it would have been impossible to do. But then we went back to the countries and said, this is the decision, but you are in charge of how you do it, and over how, like over 3 years, you are in charge of how to do that. I must say this is the most, till now, it's the most emotive and difficult decision.
Yeah.
I think it's important to also make sure we don't do that. You don't do that at the wrong level. I think we tried to do that through a very participative approach, and that is impossible. You can't ask more junior staff to take decisions of those magnitude. They're personally involved, and we got that wrong. And we then had another go with, as Olga says, the people who've got autonomy but enough seniority to do that. And the other thing I think is you can't overanalyze that. Big fan of a spreadsheet from my side. You can't spreadsheet your way to the answer on this one. So yes, we had, as Olga says, some objective data, and we made sure everyone was aware of that and talked about that and did that in stages. Go look what the criteria. Here's what the numbers say. But it's a judgment decision, not a numbers decision. And it's getting the people who've got the seniority to give that judgment, that breadth of understanding, regional directors and the like who look after the regions. But are close as well and are able to have control of actually, the numbers might say one thing, but you're missing this context that I know, and that's important, and it's a tightrope, but and we didn't get it right first time, but that's how we did it.
At the end of the day, it was about whether we will be able to make to have an impact in those places with the limited resources we had.
I'm conscious that I'm asking quite a lot of questions, and I don't want to crowd anybody out. So if you have a question to ask, please either raise your hand so we can see you on the screen, or an electronic hand, or put something in the chat. But I'd just like to say, so did you, because of this process, find yourselves accessing different kinds of data than you would access in a more usual strategy process? I mean, I see, Olga, you're nodding, so maybe you could start.
Yeah, definitely. I think because we had a lot of people engaged, both externally and internally, we also, I think it wasn't a fully internal process, just to be very clear. I think we reached out to around 50 organizations, some of them externally as well. Some of them we just interviewed, some of them did the pieces of work for us, etc. And because there were a lot of people engaged, we prioritized some really good think pieces to inform the strategy in the beginning. And I don't think we would have done it if it were not such a participatory way. And I think we have a good good assets now to through that. We also reached out to very unusual organizations, like we worked with the Institute of Futures. What is it called? Institute of Future Institute, International Future Institute. That were doing some future scenarios, modeling, etc. It was organizations we have never worked before, never thought of. So that I think that's also an answer to your exploration question, Chris. I think the organization learned a lot through the process. I definitely did.
Doug.
Thank you. This is very interesting. Thanks for making time to share this with us. It's much appreciated. Something I'm curious about, given everything that you've gone through, to what extent is the learning that you've uncovered and the way in which you've worked useful to you for future dialogue and future pieces of work? So I guess, have you found as going through this process that what you're learning and how you're working is informing other work that you're doing in interesting and useful ways, or is it kind of that's what it's for and that's where it sits? Is it adaptable, I guess?
Yeah, thank you. That's an excellent question. I just to say that when we started this process, we did a review of our previous strategy process. Actually, we asked people who were there about what worked and what didn't, and we used it to set up the parameters, but also to do things in a way that works. And I think we have done the same with this one. What hasn't worked, and now I think one of the things that we learned is how to do organization-wide conversations better, how to involve people. We talk about widely, not widely, but wisely. Sometimes we learned how to do consultations with the right people at the right time in the right way. And also, I think each country is now developing their own mini strategies to make sure that they align. And we're using those lessons in this process. So yes, a lot of learning. It was recorded and documented. And hopefully, even if we are not there, a lot of people who were here, it would sustain a conversation.
We've got another question in the chat, which for the recording, I'll just read out. How did you, from Jackie, how did you identify the most pressing conversations, contentious conversations? What was the process and what was the impact of this process? Is it on track in terms of the impact of the strategy you landed on? There's sort of several questions within there.
Several questions there, aren't there?
Yeah, so have a look back to the chat, but I thought I'd just read it out for the recording.
Should we might do them one at a time? I think that first one about identifying the conversations. I mean, I think there's two things here. Like any organization, everyone, people know the things that are sort of to be resolved, particularly after you're 6 years into your old strategy. It's not as if they haven't come up. So we knew quite a few, but we also asked people. We did, we launched the process as well as we launched this not the beginning, as I said, but some months in, saying, here's what we're doing, here's what we're looking at, and we invited people to comment on it at various points, and some things did bubble up from those processes, either from the things we anticipated, but some things did come in from the side. I talked about the private sector earlier. That's true. So there was quite a lot of prior knowledge, because where the sore points in the organisation are, and some other things around that. Well, I think that was organic rather than very strictly structured. In terms of that, I wouldn't say we had a very clear formal process for doing that, but I think an awful lot of listening. So one of the things we did was we had a monthly strategy hour. There were several hours for time zones, where Olga and I just made ourselves available, did a bit of presentation, and let people ask questions, and that did catch a bit of the things that people were anxious about and worried about, many of which we'd thought about, but not by no means all. Olga, I don't know whether you want to jump in on that one, and then we might talk about how we are in sort of impact and implementation.
No, I don't know.
So then, and again, impact. Look, we this is quite a big deal, this strategy. So Olga and I could easily have written a basically the same sort of thing, keep going, tweak a bit here strategy. This is not one of them. And we were deliberate about that at the beginning of the process. So there's quite a lot of change in the organization that needs to happen. There's quite a lot of external stuff going on too. So I think it has what's been hugely encouraging and is bearing fruit, as we were saying at the beginning of this, I think, is that because there's real buy-in and understanding in a whole range of areas, because of this process, it's enabled people to get on with things quicker than they would have done otherwise. That upstream versus downstream that Olga was saying. So is everything exactly on time and exactly perfect? No, clearly it's not in terms of what's happening, but a whole range of things are happening across the organization to get stuff done, be that writing country strategies, recruiting some of the key people we're going to need to bring those skills in. That's the whys of that are well understood, and that's me moving the hows and the whats along on a pretty good time frame. And we, as a reflection on this strategy versus previous ones, we are a bigger organization than we were 7 years ago and certainly 10 years ago, and we made a deliberate choice, and again we signaled this right up front and then did some work to explain what it might be or understand what it might be, that we would need this time, we would need time to implement, and we would need resource to implement, which is what we are doing right now. Ask us in a year or two whether we did it all, but that's the stage right now, and I think it's going pretty well.
I want to build on that, Will. I think it's a good question. What's the impact of the strategy? The impact is that for an organization that is quite devolved and quite federated, this is a global glue. This is about what we collectively want to achieve in 10 years' time, what we collectively will focus on and what we won't, and how we will do that, what will be the major shifts to make. And we even had some big ambitional targets up front. And that's, the global glue is very important for this kind of federated structure, so that what we do has an aggregate impact, rather than, it's not like let thousands of flowers bloom and because ultimately it is about universal access to water, sanitation and hygiene to poor people, to people in the developing countries that do not have it. And that we need it, that helps us focus our attention, our resources, and our intellectual capabilities.
Yeah. So I know we're getting very close to the end. I'm sure John has got something he wants to say before we finish, but I do want to ask, so would you, if you move job and become strategy director of some other organization, would you do this again? Do you think you could do it again somewhere else?
I think, Chris, it's important to work with the culture of the organization. I don't think the same process, elements of the process, of course, will work. So what I'm saying, to do a strategy, you need to understand the DNA and the soul of the organization and work with it. You can stretch it. You can make sure if it's a command and control, I don't think you can do it in the army, for example, in the same way. But definitely some elements of it will work. And I think there is a lot of learning that is transferable. And the other thing I want to say is that people or leaders do not consult their teams at their own peril, because there is so much wisdom and expertise that is underestimated, and especially at people who are perceived to be junior. So I think I wouldn't do it in the same way. I would work with the culture, but I would bring in a lot of elements of this.
I think I'd give it the same answer. I think the underlying principles are sound, and I think in a lot of contexts. I think for other organisations I've worked in, the price how is different. I think there's another win. One is, as Olga says, that real insight you get from across the organisation. But two is, you want your strategy to be, you don't want your strategy to be a big unveil moment. Sort of, isn't it exciting? No one knows what it's going to say. That's not helpful. What you want is your strategy to go, we've been part of this. We might not all be behind it, but we know why this has happened, and we've been able to contribute. And I think that level of trust and engagement with all staff is critical to the success of the strategy. things imposed on people tend not to
Yeah.
be the best way to motivate people, whereas things that people are participated in are enthusing. And I've watched strategies being imposed. I think I've written them as a consultant that have come top down, and it's a dead hand on the organization if it doesn't land well.
Yeah, some principles of ownership, using people's wisdom in the organization, being clear about decisions, but most importantly, no surprises. There shouldn't be any surprise. It shouldn't be a ta-da, here is the strategy unveiled. I think that there are some key things that is a good practice, actually. Yeah.
And can I just add one thing to that, going back to your point about the upstream, downstream timescale, Olga, because I think there's something for whoever makes the decision about we're going to do it participatively or top down, that's a really important point to know, that it may well and almost certainly will take longer doing it participatively, but that you're actually already engaging people, and they will start to behave differently purely through their experience of being involved in it. Because I think sometimes if somebody's not experienced it before, the fact that it will take a bit longer can be quite but I want to get my strategy done in 3 months or whatever. But I think it's really helpful to be able to talk about that trade-off.
Yeah, it only takes longer if you think that the strategy is in fact the document. Yeah, the strategy isn't the document. The strategy is everything you do, coherently or not, from now to 2032, and it will take till 2032. and what you've done is brought people in so that they can do it, and I applaud you for that. John.
Thank you. I sort of just 4 points really standing out for me now. This idea of who is this strategy for? I thought when you said it's for the program leads in the countries, and it's this idea you're writing it for those people, and therefore any process, anything has got to connect with their reality. I thought that's a really good question to ask. I was then reminded of the old cliche that you can only change by moving into the adjacent space. In other words, you've got to work with what is. And this whole thing, you've got to work with the culture as it is, which means warts and all. Don't pretend that suddenly, because we've announced that we're a participative strategy process, that suddenly all the command and control habits are going to disappear. My third one comes from my own sort of research, which is this whole thing of senior people always overestimate how much they know. And so actually how you get them to take seriously sources of knowledge that exist, particularly amongst more junior, the sort of the marginalized voices. And the fourth one was actually about some of the things that I just wanted to repeat, but it stuck with me from talking to Will and Olga about how they engaged. And what they haven't mentioned is that they ran nearly all the workshops in both French and English, because those were the two languages. And I just think how many organizations actually pay attention to what language are we going to use around here? What's the language that the people who are going to be affected by this strategy and want to be involved, what language do they need to hear it in? And I also just like, you talked about working with groups of 4 or 400. And again, that's the great thing of the COVID thing, is you could scale up or down like that. But it was the idea of if 4 people turned up, they were the 4 people who needed to be there. If they were the 400, they were the 400 who needed to be there. And I think that flexibility to just, you keep doing it, and whoever needs to be there will be there.
Brilliant. Wonderful. Well, I mean, for me, I just want to say thank you. I want to say thank you, John, for helping to pull all of this together from being work in practice to becoming a really good article, which I'm looking forward. I've read it. I've been lucky to read the draft, and I'm looking forward to seeing it actually out so that everybody can see it. And to Olga and Will for being willing to tell the story. And thank you for doing it again today.
Thank you so much.
Our pleasure.
No, it's great. And before we close, I just want to say this is not the end of our Do Strategy Better series. We're hoping that we'll come back to a couple more conversations like this with an organization from the food sector that's going through a lot of turmoil at the moment, and at the same time as the turmoil is pursuing a participative strategy and change. And there possibly will be one as well in integrated healthcare, although that's a bit further off. Our next pop-up, we hope, will be with Barbara Bander. And John, do you want to say something about that? Because it's your idea, and it's a bloody good idea.
Barbara has just published a book called The Model Black, and she takes head on the whole, what is it like being a Black British professional? And she has written this book, as she puts it, in a way to help us step out from problematizing Black people and vilifying white people. And she's actually written the book for people exactly like me, white British establishment, which is to give us the confidence to step into a conversation about race, which often we tiptoe around the edge of. And she is just one of the most compelling and inviting speakers I have ever come across.
So we hope to get that in the diary for late November with a bit of luck. So we're working with Barbara now to find a date. And then just before Christmas, we have a Christmas special, completely different. It's with Alan Frater, psychotherapist who specializes in the development of creativity and vision. He's written a book called Waking Dreams, and he's going to run a couple of hours as a mini session. Rick, can you remember the date? That we actually have a date for that? Rick's going to have a look for it.
I think it's December 6th, but I'll confirm.
Yeah, but don't worry, we will include it in what we send out. And that's absolutely not specifically in the Do Strategy Better series. It's a end of year, start of year dive into creative thinking and creative dreaming. So lots more to come, but for now, thank you for coming. Philippa?
Yeah, and I was just going to echo thanks to everybody for contributing, and we will be sending out the recording because, as we said, there are quite a lot of people who've signed up who haven't been able to join, so we will be sending it out. So thank you to everybody for allowing that to happen, and thank you very much. It's been terrific to see everybody, and Olga and Will, just really fascinating story.
Thank you.
Thanks all.
Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Safe travels, everybody.
Bye.
Bye-bye now.
Bye.